In telling how I became an author, I should be able to expatiate on the fact that I took to writing professionally before leaving kindergarten. As a matter of fact, I was 35 years old before I wrote my first.
I was raised in a town called Rockport, which is on the northern cape of Massachusetts. It was a little fishing village, artist gallery community. It was very isolated, nothing to do, nowhere to go. You had the ocean on one side and the forests behind you. When I was about 11 or 12, I remember going over to my friend's house. He was drawing these, what I now know were Tharks, these sort of 9-foot, 10-foot tall characters with 4 arms, swinging swords at this sort of half-naked guy, and I didn't know what the heck that was. And I asked, and they said, oh, it's John Carter. Just at that time, in the mid-'70s, there was this limited run of a comic book series of stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Part of Carter's attraction for me as a kid was just the grand adventure of another world.
My early career was a great disappointment. I had failed in every enterprise I had ever attempted. At last, I got placed as an agent for a lead pencil sharpener. We advertised in a number of magazines, and I sometimes took the magazines home to read. I remember thinking that if other people got money for writing such stuff, I might too, for I was sure I could write stories just as rotten as theirs. A Princess of Mars was published as Under the Moons of Mars by Norman Bean, a pen name that I adopted because I was mortified by the thought of having my own name connected with anything as foolish as fiction writing.
Burroughs was definitely slumming it for a paycheck on John Carter Mars when it started out, and then I think it grew into something bigger.
It really saved his life. Writing it saved his life. He was desperate. It wasn't financial desperation, it was existential despair. You can feel that the way John Carter is transported to Mars, the depth of that yearning to just break free of your body, to break free of the bonds of Earth and go adventuring and wandering.
I resolved to give my imagination free rein. The result was the Martian stories.
I think that one of the things that you have to give Edgar Rice Burroughs credit for is the quality of world building. I mean, he created virtually entire languages, entire cultures.
I think that he was onto something really substantial thematically, and I think that there are shining moments that still ring out a century later. So when Burroughs points to Mars, he's really pointing to here. It's dwindling resources, it's tribalism returning as we fight for water, as we fight for anything. What's nice about science fiction when done right is it actually has a relevance to us in the present day.
Highly imaginative fiction, such as I write, demands the retention of a youthful and elastic mind.
The important scientific element that fed Edgar Rice Burroughs' imagination, I think, was the work of this one astronomer, Percival Lowell, kind of a gentleman astronomer, and had gone out to Arizona and built an observatory and looked at the planet Mars.
Speculation about life on the planets goes very far back, at least 400 years. Mars rose up in that speculation when Percival Lowell observed Mars. And according to his read of what he saw through the lens, there were canals on Mars. And he wrote entire books on the existence of canals on Mars. His imagination got the better side of him, And then there are his hand drawings. Elaborate networks moving in and out of what he identified as cities. This was good stuff if you have imagination and you're a novelist.
As the surface of Mars was formally identical physically with the Earth, and as similar conditions doubtless still prevail on both planets, there's no reason to question a like evolutionary development from identical life forces.
The influence of John Carter on Mars is far-reaching. There's a lot of stuff that's just so deeply ingrained into the very fabric of what fantasy sci-fi is. I've heard comparisons that Superman comes from it because he was a man who had super strength. I see a lot of the reverence with which Lucas attacked the Star Wars universe, the idea of the princess, and the idea of being able to have a fantasy story told on a sci-fi backdrop. John Carter is hitting some mythological nerve. There's strong archetypes and there's strong imagery in those books.
This is a very well-imagined world that Edgar Rice Burroughs has created. John Carter had to be there in order for Star Wars to happen or Avatar to happen.
Wherever you might look around in the media landscape, in the world of fiction or films, you can credit Edgar Rice Burroughs for having had a hand in that.
Publicity is essential to success. With all the thousands of books on display in a bookshop, I had to bend every effort to have my covers not only artistic, but at the same time demanding the attention of the passerby.
Pre-internet, pre-videotapes and everything, the only way you could see literature realized visually was the illustrations of these books.
When I was first buying those books as an 11-year-old kid, the illustrations went from interesting to amazing. The artist was a man named J. Allen St. John. J. Allen St. John became the reigning illustrator for all the Burroughs books.
St. John's work really illustrates my stories. His visualizations of some of the nightmare creatures of my imagination are truly remarkable. After the success of Tarzan, motion picture royalties began coming in regularly. With my career safely insured, we moved to California and founded Tarzana Ranch. It's far removed from the unnatural pressures of the big city. That is, except for the Hollywood producers who come around looking to buy the rights to my stories.
In the 1930s, Bob Clampett, a Warner Brothers animator, wanted to do John Carter of Mars as a full-length feature animated film. And he did some test footage. He couldn't get the backing to do that film, and so the project languished.
I came to John Carter in the late 80s. At that point in time, the digital age had not quite blossomed, and there wasn't really a way to do all of the character work in the film other than prosthetics and puppets and suits and so forth, so it eventually fizzled out.
Back before Iron Man, we developed John Carter Mars for like a year, but the studio let it go. People have been trying to make this movie for nearly 100 years. And I remember when Andrew Stanton was attached, Disney immediately picked up the rights. And at that point, I was just excited to see it as a fan, because I knew he would do something interesting with it.
The biggest challenges for adapting the material on the screen was how to give it a sense of a preordained three-act structure, because the books didn't have that. It suffered from the episodic nature of how it was originally written. I was looking to, in a way, preserve the most memorable people and situations and relationships and set pieces that I did from the book, but have it all be of a much larger grand design.
I think Edgar Rice Burroughs was way ahead of his time as well, and especially for his first science fiction novel. And it's actually the 100-year anniversary, so it's kind of perfect that we're making the film.
Once in 100 years, perhaps, there's a great piece of fiction that actually molds public opinion. I have the great satisfaction of knowing that I gave those people who bought my books the best my ability permitted.
These are these grand novels of hairbreadth escapes. and daring rescues and mighty armies clashing. And you have all these elements of the swashbuckling romance story, but it's transported to another world where anything is possible.
The desire to make movies is a desire to create worlds and characters that are beyond what you know you're going to experience firsthand in your own life. And I think the desire to see the stories of John Carter put on the screen was the strongest thing that stayed with me through my whole life. The thing that surprises me the most is I look up and I go, it's actually happened. It's actually happened. It's got put on the screen.
Barsoom.